Usually, whenever people ask what is GraphQL, answer would be it is query language or it is data manipulation language. But in this video, I want to make sure everything is simple in terms so that you understand what is GraphQL. Just think of GraphQL as a technology which connects backend into front end, so that whatever the backend database and all the amazing things you have in the backend gets connected into front end, and you can use front end in order to get whatever the data you want to get from backend. Probably if you want to get all the products from your database, so that time you issue one query to backend server saying I want all the products. If you are allowed to do that transaction, that time backend will send the data, whatever the relevant data that has been asked from front end, and it will give it to the user. So now you might ask, like, isn't it same as like HTTP request where we send get, put, post, delete request and request whatever the data we require from the backend? Yes, you are correct. Whatever I am saying it might sound similar to HTTP. And in the core, GraphQL actually works on HTTP itself. Every time whenever you make request to backend server, it sends one post request to whatever the GraphQL endpoint which you might have created in the backend. For example, it will send a post request to localhost colon 3000 slash GraphQL, and that's the endpoint for GraphQL. It sends post request with whatever the data which you are requesting or which you are sending from the front end. It's little bit complex. It might sound little bit complex if you are beginner, but if you know what I am talking, then you will understand that this is how GraphQL works. But if you are beginner, then don't worry. I'll try to explain it a little bit more deeper. So how this might be different from HTTP? Usually whenever we are using HTTP, we use another framework or even fetch API in order to send or receive data from backend to one specific API endpoint. Every time we have to send it to that API endpoint. For example, if you want user details, you want to send request to /users with the relevant data. If you want to save the user, if you want to just get the user, you just have to provide ID, or just all the users will be displayed whenever you need to get it. But this is actually not programming. If I talk about it more specifically, sending API request, it's actually different from whatever the coding you are used to it. You are not creating any function to get data. You are just sending it to backend, and backend might have one controller, and that controller will send the data to front end. But in GraphQL, we are using programming itself. We are using query language in order to send the data to the backend using use query hook. Or if you want to edit some item in the data or save new data, that time you use a use mutation hook in order to make sure all the data is fine. So I'm talking specifically about React and Apollo client, but you can use it for anything. It's all about sending query, and it's all about making mutation if you want to edit some data in the backend. So all these things work using programming only, meaning you will be executing one function in the backend in order to manipulate data and send it back to the front end. And little bit better use for this particular thing is if you want certain things from user. For example, if you want name, email, that's all. In REST API, in order to do that, you have to create separate endpoint, or you just have to send that much only. That time, if you want some other detail, maybe about user, that time you have to create another API endpoint, or you have to manipulate backend API only. But in GraphQL, you can request only certain data you want. If you just want about, then your query should be just getting about, and backend will return just about from backend, rather returning all the data like in REST API, which we are familiar with. So because of this, all the unnecessary data which you query from backend is eliminated, and only useful details only will be available whenever you need it. So that's another benefit of it. So let's just try to understand a little bit more deeply about GraphQL's terminology. So it's all about GraphQL having query and mutation. So mutation means updating or creating new data with relevant ID if you are sending it. And query is all about getting the data from the backend, whichever the data you need. It's not like you need to get all the data from the database. You can request certain data and it will give you that data itself. And you can request all the data from the backend, or you can request even with the by sending specific ID. The more better option is you will be creating all this in terms of function itself. It's not like you have to send some API request to some endpoint. You are just connecting once to the backend server, and once that connection is done, every time whenever you are requesting, you just have to write the name of the function which will be executed in the backend. You don't have to write any kind of HTTP get request, post request, patch request, or anything like that. Updating means you have to use mutation, and querying means you just have to use a query. That's all. Simple as it is. GraphQL is not like something different when you're learning, and GraphQL doesn't replace any kind of backend logic. So whatever the logic you used to write in your controller, that remains same. You have to still connect to the database, and you have to still like make sure whatever the authentication and authorization happens in the backend. It's just that you will have to execute function from the front end to the back end rather sending certain API request to some endpoint. So now you might ask, is it good way to develop website? I think it is amazing way to develop website, because the thing is whenever we are learning programming or whenever we are learning web development, that time the main biggest hurdle is explaining someone what is get request, post request, put request, and delete request. Because the thing is people don't understand that that's how HTTP requests work, that in order to manipulate something in the backend, you have to send certain request to the backend. Those days were amazing where you just had to use get request and post request only, but due to all these amazing frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js, you can send multiple requests in some other HTTP forms like get request, post request, put request, delete request, patch request. All these requests are available in React and all this amazing framework. So because of that, nowadays in order to explain someone that these are the HTTP requests and this is how you need to code, it is like you are imposing some different thing on them rather like a programming which they have learned. So this particular thing that is GraphQL, it actually makes sure that you are just executing function in the backend, and from front end you are just calling that function, and it's very simple to explain it to someone who just have finished their programming journey and now they want to learn web development with the backend and front end. For them, explaining that, see, there is one function in the backend, it gets executed whenever you call it from front end. That's very amazing way to explain it to someone. But I don't recommend that you directly jump and convert all your existing project or start working on new project in GraphQL. It's not like that. It's not that much easy to directly jump into some other technology where you are not familiar with. Try to do some demo projects, try to do just CRUD operation, add authentication to it. Once you have done all those things, it's easier to move to GraphQL rather like directly jumping into it, because you might find it difficult. Because all these get request, post request, once you got familiar with it, it's easy to use and you might have already have some system and experience in order to make sure that works fine. But GraphQL is like little bit different, but it has its own amazing benefit as well as executing one function in the backend is always amazing compared to sending one HTTP request. If you are with me, then hit that like button. If you are not, then explain why that is better in comment section and I'll reply to it there. GraphQL schemas are just structure for whatever the data you want to be structured. For example, in user schema, you have to specify user has one name. Is it required? Like is it can it be nullable? And maybe name, email, password, all these things will be included in GraphQL schema. So this concept GraphQL schema is somewhat similar to whatever the database schema you might have in your program, because it's same data which you will be querying, but it has little bit more advantage in terms of validation and authorization, or giving some permission to the user. So that's how the GraphQL schemas exists. And how do you get started with GraphQL? Getting started with GraphQL is easy. If you are already familiar with React and Node.js, then you can just use Apollo client in the front end as well as in the back end. Everything will be done using Apollo client in the front end as well as back end, and your GraphQL problems are solved. If you are using some other technology, maybe Apollo client and server might be available for that framework also. So feel free to go to Apollo's documentation and use it. So that's it for this video, guys. And if you like this kind of videos, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit like button to this video so that you will get more videos like this in the future. So that's it for this video, guys, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.